across the country, university campuses are under a lot of pressure when it comes to violence prevention, particularly sexual violence prevention. So I'm sure Sarah's been incredibly busy dealing with all that across the state and across the nation. Sarah's been in the field for a very long time. We actually worked together years ago at Weave, where she was also doing outreach and education. She's currently a post instructor, and that's a peace officer standards and training instructor. She's a master instructor for law enforcement, and she trains on victim dynamics and victim interviewing. She also trains on working with victims and witnesses. So she's really out there trying to create a voice for victims in the world of law enforcement. Sarah, come on up.
When we're talking to a victim, why they may have a difficult time giving us the information that we really want them to give us. And this is something that I often hear from folks that I work with in law enforcement and in other environments is, why isn't this person acting like a victim? Or why can't they just give me the information that I'm asking for? And they have a really hard time understanding why it is that this person is having such a difficult time sharing the experience that they had experienced. Most people have this sort of idea of memory, especially around a traumatic event, as sort of a flashbulb memory. We've all heard of that, right? This concept of that when something really, really traumatic happens, that somehow embeds itself, it imprints itself into our brains in a linear fashion. Every detail is stored. We're able to recall it at any given moment in an A through Z fashion, no problems whatsoever. Most people have that perception of how memory is stored. And then along with that, sort of these ideas of how a legitimate or a real victim should act. And that's really shaped by society and, how our society believes a victim should act, what's presented to us in the media, what's shown to us on television and movies. So this is not any one particular person's downfall. It's just how we believe victims should be based on what we've seen in the media and news. So I don't want to bore you too much with a lot of neurobiological jargon, but I do think that it's important to understand a little bit about how the brain functions and how, when stress is experienced, how that changes our brain function in that moment and impairs our ability to store memories in the way that we think they should be stored. So if you can think back to maybe a biology class that you took way back when, most people are pretty familiar with pituitary gland, right? Everybody knows what your pituitary gland does, and well, hopefully some of you know. So one of the functions is this release of hormones. And when there is an experience that's happening for somebody where they are under a lot of stress, and I know that you talked yesterday about stress and trauma, but when there is an experience that places somebody in great fear and they're experiencing trauma, one of the things that happens is that the brain releases what's called these stress hormones. So in particular, catecholamines, cortisol, opiates, and oxytocin. So they all work together in conjunction to help that person survive emotionally through that trauma. And our evolution sort of works against us sometimes because those catecholamines also are responsible for our fight or flight response. And then most of you have also heard of the term the freeze response, right? So we'll talk in a minute about tonic immobility, which is the technical term for the freeze response. But when those catecholamines are released, one of the things that it does is it impairs somebody's ability for critical thought and decision-making in that moment. So a lot of times what I'll hear people say is, well, why didn't you just leave in that moment? Why didn't you fight back? Why didn't you scream? Why didn't you X, Y, or Z, right? Any of those things. Well, those catecholamines that have been released are physically, they're neurologically impairing that person's ability to even process what their options are in that moment. They can't perceive what their options are in that moment, let alone act them out. So that's sort of the first step. So not only do we have this large amount of stress hormones that are coursing through our brains when we're experiencing that extreme trauma and stress. But we also have this memory function that's happening, right? So our hippocampus is what's responsible for the encoding and sort of storing of memories. So what happens is the hippocampus takes in all of the sensory information. So you're all doing that right now. The sound of my voice, the feel of the pen in your hand, the seats that you're sitting in, the temperature in the room, all of that is being taken in, processed through your hippocampus, encoded, and consolidated. And then it's sent to another area of the brain, an appropriate area of the brain, for later retrieval. When there is an emotional situation that's happening, that memory is stored in the amygdala. And many of you probably are familiar with the amygdala because it's responsible for some of the more primitive emotions. So fear is very tightly associated with the amygdala. Sometimes when somebody is being interviewed around their experience, either being a victim of domestic violence or sexual assault, how that plays out is there's an expectation that you should be able to start with A and get through Z, and you should do it in a quick fashion. And that if you're stalling or hesitating, then there's an assumption that they're making it up. And then the interviewer may be asking for more information and sort of berating them with questions about why it's taking them so long to give them the information that they're asking for. So that's a little bit of information about how memory functions, in particular around stress and trauma. In general, and this data, some of this statistics or information is really coming from research specifically around sexual violence, but I would like for you to think about the intersections between domestic violence and sexual violence. The vast majority of sexual violence survivors know the person who has assaulted them. And I think sometimes folks have this perception that, folks that are assaulted by strangers, that's going to be like the real trauma, and that folks that are assaulted by somebody that they know, that somehow there's less trauma with that. And that is so not the case. The reality is that the experience of trauma is really subjective to that individual, that person. So in general, memories that are experienced through trauma or stored through trauma tend to be accurate but not complete. One of the things that does impair that is alcohol or drug use. So somebody who has been drinking or using during the time of the assault or closely during the time of the assault may have a difficult time retrieving information because it was never encoded in the first place. So it's just missing. It's like the Post-its just don't have anything on them. The other thing is that central information will be more clear to them than peripheral information. So sometimes folks will want a description of something that they just really don't have because that's not what they were focusing on during the abuse or the assault. So sometimes somebody will want a really great description of, let's say the hair color and the eye color of the assailant. And the victim really can't give that to them, but they can give them a really fantastic description of the door handle of the inside of the car that they were in. So it's really, those central details are really subjective to that person. The other thing is that memory tends to increase over time. So there's a lot of research around when is the best time to interview somebody and when is the best time to get that information from somebody. And generally speaking, 2 to 3 sleep cycles is required for the hippocampus to be able to consolidate those memories and for the person to process that, to be able to verbally articulate it back to somebody. In addition to all of that, because of the way those memories are stored, they're often connected to sensory information. So many of you have probably been in a situation where you've either heard a song on the radio or smelled something or felt a texture, and that took you back to a moment in time previously in your life. This happens to me all the time when ABBA comes on the radio, in particular Dancing Queen. So I won't sing it for you, but most people have some sort of experience like that where they can say, yes, this memory is tied to this sensory information. And that's the same for victims and survivors as well, for sexual violence and for domestic violence, that they will be re-triggered by sometimes things that don't seem to be triggers. We wouldn't assume that they would be triggers, but to them they are triggers because it's tied to their memory of the assault or the abuse. So what does that end up looking like? I get a lot of questions about why do victims act a certain way, or why are they doing this, in particular around post-assaultive behaviors like not breaking up with the person who assaulted them, going back to an abusive situation, placing themselves back into a high-risk situation. All of those things seem counterintuitive to folks that haven't experienced that abuse or that assault. So some of these may look familiar to you. So we may see somebody who's crying and hysterical, although I would probably say this is maybe 10 to 15% of the people that I've worked with over the years. This ends up being the thing that is most presented in movies and television and media. And I will even say I did a training yesterday for law enforcement, and they have the opportunity to interview an actor who's playing a victim. And it's a great training opportunity because otherwise you would have these cops interviewing each other, and that doesn't always go super well. You know, you imagine role playing with each other, with your peers and your colleagues here, and it's much different when you have a professional actor that's playing that role. And the actor, even the actor playing that role of the sexual assault survivor, really was kind of bought into this stereotypical response of a sexual assault survivor. And so that was a conversation that we ended up needing to have, is that while, yes, this may be the reaction for some folks, this is not the reaction for all folks. I'm going to pull up all of these so we can just look at them. I think I've got them all. So some of the things that come up, again, that folks find most counterintuitive, maybe promiscuity or placing themselves back into a situation where it's high risk, not leaving the abuser, continuing to be in the presence of the abuser or the assailant. Laughing and joking. And a lot of times what I'll tell folks is, if you imagine what your normal coping strategy is, what is your normal coping strategy that you use to get through stress and trauma? And whatever that is probably what you will use to deal with extreme stress and trauma. So if you're one of those people that deals with stress and trauma or just everyday stress by laughing or telling jokes about it or self-deprecating humor, that is what you may likely do if you were experiencing extreme trauma. And we all know folks that do that. If you're one of those people who really just doesn't like to talk to people about your everyday stress, or that when you experience something traumatic, that you're likely to put it all in a box and shove it up onto a shelf and never really look at it again, that may be your likely method of dealing with stress and trauma in the future. Likely, maybe not guaranteed. The other thing that I think is important to recognize is that when an experience of violence happens, and like Elaine was saying, with domestic violence, we're talking about an environment that somebody is in. And you may be looking at an event that they experience, but they're living in an environment where this is ongoing and daily. And so when folks are experiencing something like that, they will often try to either shift the event for themselves, because it's easier than changing their worldview. So all of us in this room have something that we consider a tightly held worldview. And for most people have a tightly held worldview that the world is a relatively safe place, that people who love them won't hurt them, and that if they're in a situation where they're in danger, that they would be able to care for themselves, that they would be able to get themselves out of that situation. I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say, well, I would fight and scratch and scream and kick and gouge their eyes out and, pepper spray and, knee kicks and all of that. But when there's an event that comes into conflict with that tightly held worldview, is it easier to reconstruct your tightly held worldview or reframe the event that just happened? And that's what we'll often see. Now, for domestic violence survivors, their worldview is a whole lot different than ours. Their whole worldview is much, much different. And so those events are likely to be minimized and sort of shoved away and denied until maybe something happens that really forces them to look at, this is a really serious situation, like a serious injury, or maybe children being injured in a fight. So I say all of that, and I don't want to leave us with this feeling of, that we can't do anything about it. Some folks have heard of the term secondary traumatization. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly. But there is sort of this process where somebody is going through the process of reporting or asking for help or looking for resources. And occasionally, many times, they will be met with questions like, why? Why didn't you run? Why didn't you leave sooner? Why didn't you fight? Why didn't you scream? Why did you stay in the first place? A lot of those why questions. And those why questions can be perceived very quickly, very easily as being blamed. I mean, they're essentially feeling that they're being blamed. One of the things that I talk about a lot is that it's not really that difficult to talk somebody out of reporting. And they will overthink everything you say and do, and the look on your face and your body language. They will read into all of that. Survivors will read into all of that because there's already an internal feeling of guilt and shame. Everything that you're thinking, they're already thinking. And so when they hear it from somebody else, it's like being placed right back in that moment where they're being abused. So the best sort of advice that I can give all of us in this room is to really understand that when we're asking somebody to give us information, to give them time and space to be able to give that information. Allow them some time. Open-ended questions will give you way more information than close-ended questions. Find some other way than why to ask your question. Start it with a different word. Tell me about your experience. Tell me about what happened next. Can you provide me with more information? If you can reframe that in some way to minimize those feelings of blame that's coming from the survivor that you're working with, even if you are not intending it, and most people aren't. Most people are really well-intentioned. They just don't realize how much power the language has. So if there's some way to start it off with something other than a why and to ask open-ended questions, you will get more information and reduce the likelihood that that survivor will feel re-traumatized in the process. All of the things that I talked about earlier with the stress hormones and how memories are processed and the catecholamines, there is a change that happens in the brain when those stress hormones are released. But it is not permanent. And there is a possibility for that person to heal from that trauma. And we see it every day. We see it in the survivors that end up coming into this work. So I thank you so much for all the work that you do, for being here, for being interested in learning more about trauma-informed care. I don't know where I'm at on time. I could just keep on talking, but I think if there's a possibility to answer questions for folks later, I think that'll be good. Great. Thank you.